39 people died wearing black shrouds and Nike sneakers with $5 bills in their pockets. They were not coerced at the point of a weapon. They believed they were shedding a biological container. Marshall Applewhite told them the human body was a vehicle, temporary, disposable. He called the destination the evolutionary level above human. A spacecraft, he said, was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. The offer had an expiration date. Applewhite used a technique called loaded language, a private vocabulary that reframed death as graduation. When you control the words, you control the meaning. When you control the meaning, you control the exit. Members had been isolated from family for years. Their identities had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt inside the group's cosmology. By the time the comet arrived, leaving was cognitively impossible. Not because they couldn't, because the outside world no longer existed in any meaningful way. This was episode 7. On March 26, 1997, sheriff's deputies entered a rented mansion in Rancho, Santa Fe, California. They found 39 people in identical positions: black shrouds, black Nike sneakers, arms at their sides. Each had a small bag packed, a $5 bill and 3/4 in their pocket, fare, apparently, for the journey. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of force. What deputies had encountered was the result of a belief system so total, so architecturally complete, that its members had willingly ingested phenobarbital, mixed with applesauce, consumed vodka, and placed plastic bags over their heads. They called this the departure. Marshall Applewhite was a former music professor and failed opera singer. In 1972, he suffered what appears to have been a psychological crisis following a cardiac episode. Some accounts suggest he reported hearing voices during this period. He met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with deep interests in theosophy and astrology, in a psychiatric facility. Together they constructed a cosmology that merged Christian eschatology with science fiction. They called themselves Bo and Peep, later T and Doe. Their foundational claim was simple. Extraterrestrial beings had seeded humanity. Jesus was one such being. They were the next. Heaven's Gate was not a loose set of beliefs. It was a total cognitive system. Applewhite taught that the human body was a temporary container for a soul seed that could only be fully developed by overcoming all human desires. This included sexuality, family bonds, personal ambition, and individual identity. Members adopted androgynous appearances. Several male members, including Applewhite himself, underwent voluntary castration. The language was clinical and precise. Not leaving, but graduating. Not death, but returning to the next level. Not cult, but classroom. Psychologist Robert Lifton identified this pattern as milieu control combined with sacred science, an environment where every concept, including doubt itself, was absorbed and neutralized by the group's own interpretive framework. Heaven's Gate members were not uniquely vulnerable people. They were computer technicians, nurses, former military personnel, and academics. Recruitment typically began with public meetings, advertised as discussions about consciousness and extraterrestrial life. The group was adept at identifying individuals in transition, recently divorced, recently bereaved, recently displaced. Once inside, the isolation process was gradual. Members were encouraged to move in together, then to cut contact with non-members, then to surrender financial assets and personal possessions. By the mid-1990s, the group had established a web design business called Higher Source, allowing members to remain economically self-sufficient as a collective, while remaining entirely isolated from outside social influence. What Applewhite engineered, largely intuitively, maps precisely onto what neuroscientists now call identity disruption through social exclusion. The prefrontal cortex manages social cognition and identity. When an individual's social network shrinks to a single group, the neural processes that evaluate risk and reward become recalibrated around that group's survival. Members who had been inside for a decade or more had spent formative years building every social bond, every inside reference, every shared language exclusively within Heaven's Gate. Leaving did not feel like freedom. It felt like neurological annihilation. This is why coercive control researchers emphasize that exit is not primarily a matter of willpower. It is a matter of available cognitive and social infrastructure. The members of Heaven's Gate had none. In 1995, amateur astronomers discovered Comet Hale-Bopp, the brightest comet visible from Earth in 40 years. In late 1996, a radio host claimed, falsely, that a companion object 4 times the size of Earth was trailing it. The image circulated widely on early internet platforms. For Applewhite, this was confirmation of a prophecy he had been teaching for 2 decades. He announced that a spacecraft was trailing the comet and that this represented humanity's final evolutionary window. The offer had an expiration date. The comet would pass. The craft would not return. In the weeks before March 26th, members were filmed making farewell videos. They were calm, articulate. They spoke about looking forward to the journey. They discussed shedding their containers. They had rehearsed the departure twice before, testing their willingness. The final preparation included a ritual meal at a Marie Callender's restaurant. Identical orders. Turkey pot pie. Then they returned to the mansion, consumed the sedative mixture in shifts, and covered each other with shrouds. The protocol was methodical, organized, and, by every observable measure, consensual. This is the deepest clinical question Heaven's Gate raises. Can consent exist inside a system that has systematically eliminated the cognitive conditions necessary for genuine choice? Philosopher Jennifer Radin's work on epistemic coercion argues that consent requires not just the absence of external force, but the presence of accessible alternatives and the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. Members of Heaven's Gate had been systematically stripped of both. Their families were strangers. Their vocabularies had been replaced. Their neurological baseline for what constituted the outside world had atrophied. The coroner's report listed cause of death as suicide. Psychologists who study coercive control describe it differently. Heaven's Gate left behind a website. It remains online today. It continues to receive visitors who leave comments expressing alignment with the group's beliefs. Applewhite understood something about human psychology before the internet made it scalable. The desire to transcend the human body, to belong to something cosmic, to have a definitive answer about what happens after death. These are not fringe impulses. They are among the most common human experiences. The mechanism that produced Heaven's Gate has not been dismantled. It has simply found new interfaces. This was episode 7 of the Mind Control Archives.